So yeah, I worked here for 5 years or so at Ziba. I've been independent for about the past 2.5. This is how I'm going to introduce myself, because explaining what it is that I actually do is, generally speaking, the longest part of any conversation that I have with anybody. So essentially, I was trained as an engineer, then I was a high school teacher. Then I went to design school, then I worked as an industrial designer, then I started writing about design, and now that's mostly what I do. I write about design, I edit, I do strategy, editorial strategy, content strategy, things like that. So in 2016, I just went through my invoices and I was like, okay, this is basically what I did in 2016. So the workshops was like teaching kind of intro to experience prototyping, whatever buzzwords you read about in the design press, that's what I was teaching. And among all of these, there's about 20-ish clients, ranging from design schools to design consultancies and agencies, independents. I worked for a real estate developer briefly who did design build. So it's kind of all over the place. And then I also do a lot of kind of my own independent articles for basically whoever is interested in my stuff. And through all of this, this gives me this kind of unusual bird's eye view of the creative professions. What happens is, over the course of 8 or 9 years that I've been at this now, is certain kinds of conversations, debates come up over and over and over again. And a lot of the times when I'm writing an article, my job is to sort of make the case for one or the other side of one of these arguments. And that is essentially what I want to talk about today. So this particular presentation is going to be riffing on an article that I did last year for Design Week Portland. And they do constantly commission new work to come out, so it's really worth checking out their website. But last year they paired a series of writers with a series of presenters. I got paired with Andy Pressman, who was doing a talk called "What Do We Lose When It's Easy to Use?" And he and I sat down for a while and talked, and then I went off and did my article and he did his presentation. And his argument, which is one that I've come across a lot of times, is there's a lot to be gained from not necessarily making something as easy to use as humanly possible. But this also presents this dilemma that I see argued in both directions. So that was essentially the article, and it starts off with me talking about the New York Times app on my smartphone, and then it goes on to talking about my playing the banjo and a whole bunch of other things. And I'm going to get into kind of what I investigated and what the conclusions were. So this, when we talk about easy to use, we're talking about stuff like this, right? So that's Spotify, that's Uber, that's Airbnb, shopping on Amazon, taking a picture with your smartphone. All of these are really familiar and very successful examples of taking an act that people engage with on a daily basis and using technology to kind of cut out some of the steps, right? That gets you more quickly to the end result that you're looking for. And a lot of these things are really, really successful. I mean, if you pull up Spotify, it can literally be 10 seconds between a song popping into your head and being able to hear it. And that's extraordinary, right? That's never been true in all of human history. And now it is. And that's true of all of these other things. Conversely, there's this argument that there's an enormous amount of satisfaction and unrecognized potential in doing things the hard way, right? So if you take a picture with your smartphone, you get very quickly from I'd like to take a picture to I take a picture. On the other hand, if you decide to get really into SLR photography, there's a whole suite of other benefits that come with that you might not even be aware you're missing out on if you never get into it. Right? So these are, a lot of these are basically kind of like the analog or more difficult counterparts, the examples I gave you earlier. And so it creates this dilemma, right? On the one hand, the less friction there is, the better experience you've got. On the other hand, adversity breeds engagement. The more you have to invest in something, the more engaged you're going to become with it, the more you're going to get out of it, right? And so this is this kind of A versus B dichotomy, this dilemma that I've sort of summarized here. The great artist is the simplifier. People prefer the product or service that reduces friction. You've probably heard this term, reducing friction, comes up a lot, especially in app design. On the other hand, ease of use is robbing us of all these things: the joy of mastery, the social aspect of the interaction, the delight of the unexpected. If it's less satisfying, what's the point in getting you there more quickly? And here's some good examples. I like this one. This is Scott Belsky, who founded Behance Network, at a talk at a conference last year. And he's like, how many times has this happened? We flock to the simple product, then we crap it up with additional features, and then people flock to a different simple product, right? On the other hand, Airbnb's Steve Seltzer says, what do we lose when we remove friction? We remove opportunities for serendipity, confrontation, and personal growth. Legitimate. This one I think is especially interesting because this was at the 99U conference, which was started by Scott Belsky. So this is a debate that's happening, like people right next to each other are approaching this from two different directions. So we have this kind of A versus B. Which one is correct? And a lot of times when people look at an A versus B argument, the tendency is to say, okay, well, maybe there's a third way. Maybe the real answer is somewhere in between the two, right? And they'll propose that maybe there's this kind of C somewhere in between. So like maybe there's an ideal level of how difficult something is to use, and that's the sweet spot, and that's what we should aim for, right? So I kind of, I did what I do as a writer a lot of times, which is start kind of sifting through the case studies, the evidence. What are some examples? What can we hold up side by side and try and figure out like if there is a sweet spot to this? So here's a good example, right? That's iMovie, and that's Adobe Premiere. They both make movies. This one, you can be up and running in about 15 minutes. This one, I had to sit down next to somebody who's been using it for years, and they spent about 3 hours, and I got to the point where I could start cobbling something together, right? But one of them, they are both very successful. So what is it that makes, under what circumstances is one the better solution than the other? And so one theory I came up with, that's a sort of hypothesis, maybe the answer to the ease of use dichotomy is how many things does it do, right? So if you're getting a tool and you want it to do a whole lot of different things, then difficulty of use is totally acceptable. If there's only a handful of things that you want it to do, then the easy to use option is what you prefer. And this is the thing, right? iMovie is great for doing basically like taking all of your iPhone movies and stitching them together into something with a background track and nice fade-ins and fade-outs. It's awesome at that. But it's not that powerful. There's not a huge range of different things it can do. So, but here's the problem. I started looking at a bunch of other dichotomies of things that are relatively easy and relatively hard to use. This is a good example. So on the left is TurboTax, and on the right is Twitter. And I use both of them, and I'm going to say that in the long run, Twitter is a lot harder to use than TurboTax. If you want to get actual value out of it, right? But the thing is, TurboTax does a lot of things, right? I mean, you can come into it as a sole proprietor who's the head of household, who works in 4 different states, right? And it'll get you there. It'll get you to the end of the process because it's very, very prescriptive. Twitter, it's sort of like, have fun, and then you have to figure out how to get value out of it. And there are an enormous number of kind of hidden rules and social mores, and a big part of the reason is when you're dealing with Twitter, you're dealing with other people, and other people are complicated. So, but this also really gives lie to the idea that the more things it does, the harder to use it has to be, right? I think a lot of times it's the opposite of that. So I kind of struck that one out. So I went after another example, and again, what I'm trying to do here is take a single category and look at easy to hard within that category. So here's a fairly obvious example. There's Spotify again, and then there's collecting vinyl. And in fact, I'm going to take this one even further and go all the way to the end, which is what's the easiest possible way to hear a song, right? Type it in, hit play, done. What's a pretty hard way to hear a song? Collect a bunch of vinyl, dig through all of your LPs, pull out the right one, put it on, put the thing, right, listen with your friends. That's pretty hard. What's the hardest way to hear a song? Spend 2 years learning to play it on the banjo, right? So let's compare these a little bit. So this is the reason that I brought the banjo. I'm gonna play you a little bit, mostly because this is probably the only time I will get a chance to play the banjo for a crowd this large. I have played for a grand total of about 2 years at this point, which still makes me an absolute rank beginner. If you ever go to like a bluegrass jam and you ask somebody who sits down and can just bang out 50 different tunes, they've probably been playing for 10 years or more. This is not uncommon at all. But I'm gonna play a little bit and then I'm gonna kind of talk about what I learned in the process of playing this. So let's see, what am I gonna play? Okay, so that's an old song. It's called "Bury Me Beneath the Willow," and this is basically how far you get after 2 years. And I have been working on this particular song for probably 6 months. And you see, I'm still making like a ton of mistakes. It's not really all that fast. I mean, really good players can play at twice that speed. But in the process of learning, in the process of getting to this point, there are a number of things that I have come to realize. So one of them is that when people talk about bluegrass music, old-time music, and Celtic music, they're talking about 3 actually extremely different things, which are completely unobvious unless you start playing, right? So that kind of playing, that's bluegrass. That's called 3-finger picking. If you're doing old-time music, you don't do this. You do this, which I'm terrible at. That's a style called frailing, and I suck at it. And then Celtic has its own thing, which is apparently if you go and play in Ireland and you hit one note wrong, like they kick you out of the pub. So there's a very, very different kind of aesthetic to it, even though a lot of times the same song might be played in each of the 3 different genres. The way they're played is very different. The second one is that when you do watch somebody who's good at this, it's way more impressive. It's mind-blowing when you see somebody who's really good at this. The third is, and this was the most interesting to me, is how modular folk music is. I mean, in bluegrass in particular, but most of this. And when I say modular, I mean something like this. So the way that song started, right? That's one way of starting. There's also or right? Those are all beginnings, and they're almost interchangeable. You could start off almost any song with almost any of them. Also, the way that one ended, there's also, and there's also, so there's those. On top of that, when you first start learning to play the banjo, you learn what are called rolls. That's called a forward-backward roll. That's a forward roll. And so an awful lot of bluegrass music is simply linking together different kinds of rolls and bookending it with an intro and an outro, and then kind of mixing the melody in with those. And once you've understood that, it suddenly opens up like a tremendous amount of creativity. This is why improvisation in bluegrass is relatively straightforward, is once you've learned the basics, learning how to link them together becomes not all that different from, for example, learning swing dance and you figured out 10 different figures and then you just sort of link them together in a way that makes the most sense. So another thing that you learn in the process is that you can now improvise about 85% of all children's songs, which is great. I have a 2-year-old, and so he at one point said, "Can you play Ladybug Pick?" And I kind of was like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Ladybugs came to the ladybug picnic. You guys know this one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, because there are only really about 3 chords in most of these songs, right? In a banjo, it's G, D7, and C. And if you link those 3 together, you can play hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of songs. The other thing that you learn in this process is that old-time lyrics are really dark. And I don't know if you've ever heard this, but that song that I was just playing for you, Bury Me Beneath the Willow, this is how it goes. My heart is sad and I am lonesome for the only one I love. When will I see her? Oh no, never till we meet in heaven above. So bury me beneath the willow, under the weeping willow tree, so she will know where I am sleeping, and perhaps she'll cry for me. So this is literally, and there's many, many verses, and it's basically someone singing about how he fell in love, they were going to get married, she stood him up, and so he's going to kill himself. That's literally that's how the song goes. Or if you've heard, you've seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I'll Fly Away. Some bright morning when this life is over, I'll fly away. To that land on God's celestial shore, I'll fly away. And it's, again, verses and verses about how difficult, anguished, and disappointing life is and how everything is going to be better when you're dead. And this is and it's one thing to kind of recognize this, it's another thing to immerse yourself in it, and it's this extraordinary education in basically what life must have been like 100, 150 years ago. And I did not go into learning the banjo expecting that. And this is kind of the point that I wanted to make, is that everything is bigger on the inside. And this is true of basically every creative pursuit in my experience. The more you get into it, the more you are surprised by the things that you're going to learn and the things that you're going to learn how to do. And this, I think, is kind of the answer to this. There is no single correct answer to the ease of use dilemma, and this is not actually correct. So I'm kind of stepping over sideways again. What's the point of learning to play the banjo as opposed to just bringing up Bury Me Beneath the Willow on Spotify, of which there are hundreds and hundreds of versions? And it's because I'm doing it for a different reason, right? And what I need to come up with instead is sort of a rubric, a set of questions that says, why am I engaging with this tool? Why am I performing this task? And if I can come up with the right question, then that allows me to figure out which of the 2 answers, ease of use, adversity breeds engagement, is the right one. So bringing it back to the article and the example of Twitter, am I going to make you read this whole thing? I'll paraphrase it briefly, right? So TurboTax, Spotify, these are things that are complex in operation, but you engage with them knowing exactly what outcome you expect. You have an extremely specific expectation of an outcome. I did not start playing the banjo with a specific expectation of an outcome. I went into it with a certain amount of faith that I was going to learn to be able to do a lot of things that I cannot even conceive of now. And that is to some degree why I started using Twitter as well. And I think this is the most important thing. If I was using Twitter today the way that I used it when I first started using it, I wouldn't be using it anymore. And that is ultimately what makes it hard to use and what makes it valuable. It has this tremendous flexibility to it. So now I want to take a little sidestep here and talk briefly about the theme here, genius. And we usually think of genius in current terminology as like a really, really smart person or a really, really creative person. But historically, the term genius was a belief system from the ancient Romans that there were spirits somewhere between gods and humans that were thought to accompany each person through life as a protector. And the Latin name for this was genius, which came from the word gignere, meaning to beget. This sense of an attendant spirit was first borrowed into English in the 14th century. This idea of an attendant spirit, genius, is the one that I'm much more fond of. And what I'm proposing is that for these kinds of dilemmas, the genius is the question. The genius is the differentiator that allows you to determine when A is correct and when B is correct. So the genius for the ease of use question is how specific is the intended outcome. At least that's what I'm going to propose the genius is. Because once you have that question in mind, the dilemma becomes much, much easier to solve. So that's part one. That was the conclusion of that article. And what I'm going to do now is once I sort of came to this, all writers are constantly basically ripping themselves off. And so as soon as you come to a conclusion and you're like, I'm actually fairly happy with that conclusion, you immediately start looking for other places that you can apply it. And so I've spent the year or so since I wrote that article looking for other places to try and come up with this kind of genius as a way of solving dilemmas, or potentially solving dilemmas. And that's what part two is going to be about. So what was the approach? The approach was find a dilemma where people have really ground in their heels on both sides and try and figure out a question or a series of questions that allows you to determine when side A is correct and when side B is correct. So I'm going to start with maybe one of the most persistent ones that I have come across as a writer engaging with the design world, which is the dilemma between what I'm going to call insight-driven incrementalism and disruptive technology. So this is what I mean by that. Paying close attention to your users and what they actually need rather than what you want to provide is a revolutionary act. Insight-driven innovation is the only innovation that matters. And I have written multiple articles making this argument. Right? This is why we have user research and design research, right? To make sure that what we're doing is actually serving a user need, as opposed to just sort of showing off what we're capable of, right? This is one thing that technology companies get taken to task for frequently. On the other hand, there's a strong argument that says the truly transformative, not just the pretty, interesting, shiny ones, but the ones that have really been transformative over the last 150 years have all had a revolutionary new technology at their core, right? The automobile was an expression of the internal combustion engine. The airplane, right? An understanding of how airfoils work. The internet. So insight matters, but it's just shuffling deck chairs around. Technology is the ship. So which of these is correct?
Isn't it iterative?
Well, right. And so in order to get into sort of detail, right, because, and you're right, they are both correct, but how do we determine which one is correct in a particular situation? And so this is where I start digging into kind of case studies. So here's a really good one, right? These are three, I would call, transformative products that have completely reshaped the way that we think and behave, and yet none of them were the first in their category, right? The iPod was not the first MP3 player. Facebook did not invent social networking. The Prius was not the first hybrid. These were the first ones, in case you're curious, right? You guys remember Classmates? Classmates actually predated Friendster, it predated Tribe, it predated all of these other social networks that you may have never even heard of. Facebook was like a latecomer to the game. That's the Honda Insight, which was the first production hybrid car. So what's the question? What's the question that distinguishes the two of them? Well, I'm going to crib myself here. This is another article that I did for a design agency called Bressler Group. Without the right insights, a new technology is just a solution without a problem. But without a new technology, all the insights in the world won't get you anything besides incremental improvement. It's a two-legged process. Both are necessary for forward motion. So for a specific project, for a specific group of users, for a specific problem, what's the question? And this is my argument. Two questions. First is, how fully realized is the current technology? So when Facebook came along, social networking had been around for a while, but it didn't work that well. I don't know if you guys ever used stuff like Friendster or Classmates or whatever, but they were very, very limited because they did not connect with other things very well. Facebook was basically the first organization to come along and say, we're going to take social networking and we're going to attach it to news. We're going to attach it to commerce. We're going to attach it to instant messaging. We're going to attach it to fundraising, a million other things. And that ultimately, that was the insight that led to its tremendous success. So if you're dealing with a relatively young technology, the opportunity for insight-driven innovation is massive because chances are its full potential has not yet been realized. On the other hand, you also need to ask, how quickly can a new technology be made relevant to current needs? Because a lot of times, for very, very new technologies, there's still a lot that needs to be sorted out before it's actually going to be relevant to a large number of people. And this is why you get things like the first MP3 player, which was like, hey everyone, check it out. Totally new concept. It was an absolute nightmare to use. And it was extremely difficult to get music onto it. I had an iRiver, if you guys remember these. The interface was horrific, right? I mean, you had to have this special piece of software in order to get songs onto it, and it had to be in the right format. And so one of Apple's big realizations was it wasn't just the device, it was also the ecosystem that allowed you to get music onto and off of it. And that's what made it transformative. That's what made it relevant for a lot of people. But it still would not have ever existed without the existence of solid-state hard drives and the MP3 format. So what they did is they found a series of technologies that were new enough that they still had a lot of kind of unexplored potential, but had been around long enough that they had become relevant. They had the potential to be relevant to a lot of people. And that's really the question that you have to ask. So that's what I'm going to call the genius that helps solve the innovation dilemma. Okay, next one. The induced demand dilemma. So this is related, right? On the one hand, it's if you want to make something great, serve a real user need. On the other hand, it's build it and they will come, right? And this argument kind of breaks down like this. We don't stop designing a solution that's in search of a problem. It's a problem-solving process. If you want to make something great, you have to start with an identified need. On the other hand, right, this Henry Ford quote that I have included in probably 5 articles in my life, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. If something is truly innovative, it may satisfy a need that people didn't even realize they had. So how do you get to the bottom of this one? And I'm going to be quick on this one. Basically, anytime somebody comes along with a new product, a new service, a new development that addresses a need that people didn't realize they had, it's not because they invented a new need, it's because it was addressing the underlying need, right? When you ask people what they want and they say a faster horse, what they're saying is, I want to get to where I am going faster. That is the underlying need. And so frequently, when someone is boldly stepping ahead and putting something into the world, even though people say it's not going to work, it's not because they're trying to be an iconoclast. It's because they see the need that is underneath the need, right? This is, ask why and then ask why again. The other answer is the novelty worth the cost? Anytime you're creating a new platform, there's going to be a lot of expense in getting people up to speed on it, and there's going to be a painful learning curve. And some of that can be ameliorated by good design, but a lot of it can't, right? When the iPhone came out, people had to learn an entirely new way of doing basically everything with the device that was in their pocket. I mean, the only thing that had come along to sort of prepare us for that before that were, the BlackBerry and the Newton, right, which had to teach everybody just these little pen swipe gestural interfaces, right? So there's a huge learning curve, and you basically have to deliver so much value from this new approach that it is worth engaging with all of that novelty and expense. So those are kind of your 2 questions. That's your genius. So now I want to move on to, I'm going to get outside of the design world a little bit here, because one of the other things that I write about a lot is urban development and housing policy. And there's a really interesting dilemma that comes up there all the time as well, which is what I'm going to call the public good dilemma. Privatization versus nationalization, right? Which is the right solution to all of society's ills? And if you're following politics at all, this is kind of one of the existential questions of our nation right now. Are problems better solved by giving a freer rein to private business people who are trying to solve those problems, or are they better solved by bringing in nationalized or government programs in order to solve them? Right? And there are definitely people on both sides who would say that one or the other is always the correct solution to everything. Right? And I've watched this debate play out for years. So it looks something like this. All government programs eventually become overbuilt, self-perpetuating, and inefficient. If you want something done right, empower the ones who are doing it, not a regulatory body. On the other hand, when profit is your primary incentive, other considerations fall by the wayside. The only way to ensure that a public good actually serves the public is to prevent self-serving private entities from controlling it. Okay. I find those both to be legitimate, convincing arguments. And although I will say that for an awful long time, B was by far the more convincing for me. I think probably like a lot of people in Portland, I was kind of an unrepentant socialist for a long time. You look at graphs like this, and it's like almost how could you not be? I don't know if you saw, this is from the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, talking about income inequality in the United States and how dramatically it's shifted in the past 25-ish, 35 years, something like that. I mean, that's terrifying to me. And this strikes me as a classic example of the triumph of privatization over all else, right? We're going to deregulate things as much as possible, and this is one of the outcomes. On the other hand, so my son lives in France with his mom, and I'm out there a couple of months a year. And it's been interesting because France is a genuinely unrepentantly socialist society and has been for a very long time. And in many ways, this is great. The support for healthcare and family services is kind of extraordinary. But you also get things like this. So this is a website for a restaurant, and this is fairly typical. This is in Lille in northern France. And I don't know if you want to do the math on that. This restaurant is open 12 and a half hours a week. Right? And and this is one of, I don't know if you've ever spent time in France, one of the really difficult, mind-blowing challenges being an American is walking around wondering why everything is closed. Right? And literally, if you go there after 1 p.m. and you want to get lunch, they're like, je suis désolé, vraiment, sorry. So, and turns out there's some really good reasons for this. And I got to have a really interesting conversation with an English woman who ran a restaurant in Lille, where I spend time, with her French husband. And I sort of asked her about that. And she said, well, hiring regulations and protections in France are so strong that it is, if you are not at least 50% full as a restaurant, you are losing money. And so the strategy that most places take is they open for very short periods of time in order to maximize the number of people that they have in there, and then they close before it starts to peter out. But what ends up happening is her restaurant employed 4 people. It was a good-sized restaurant. A restaurant like that in Portland would employ probably 12. And so this is kind of the trade-off, is the protections on workers are so strong that it actually disincentivizes people to hire them. And so what you have is a system where there's an enormous number of safety controls that ensure that even if you can't find work, you're going to be able to live your life, right? You won't starve, you won't die of a preventable disease. But on the other hand, very, very little effort is put into trying to prevent the causes of unemployment in the first place. And so this is the trade-off. So this is one example of kind of like the privatization versus nationalization debate. Here's another one, which is housing policy. This is one I've written about a little bit. I did that one on the left, and then this other one came up not too much later. And this is regarding why is the rent so damn high, basically. And people debate this a lot. And so this article that I did was a profile earlier this year of this movement called the YIMBY movement. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. So you know the term NIMBY, not in my backyard? Okay, so YIMBY is yes in my backyard. It's basically pro-development housing advocates. And there are people, and it's a lot of millennials really, who have gotten so frustrated with the housing markets in places like San Francisco and Portland that they are actually organizing to go to meetings and protest in favor of the construction of high-density housing. Which is a fundamentally different approach to affordable housing advocacy up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it's very controversial. And in fact, in San Francisco, and this is one of the interviews that I did, she was like, well, yeah, 90% of politics in San Francisco is land use politics. Everyone agrees about everything else, right? Everyone is liberal except for when it comes to land use. And then you can have two people who both say that they're the progressives who are just tearing each other limb from limb because they have very, very different perspectives on what's the best approach to this. So, this is a difficult one. Right, because being pro-development means basically saying we need to make it easier for private developers to make more money. And that's a very difficult pill for a lot of people to swallow. So I'm going to put that one on the back burner for just a second. I'm going to give you another example. This was actually the most instructive example within the privatization nationalization debate for me. So this is the FedEx Super Hub in Memphis, which I got to tour many years ago. If you ever get a chance to, it is one of the most mind-blowing things I've ever seen, right? They process 500,000 packages an hour there. But one of the things is, as you watch all of these boxes go by, what you see mixed in with them occasionally are big sacks marked U.S. Postal Service. And I asked somebody about that, and they said, oh, yeah, the USPS contracts FedEx to do a lot of it, a big chunk of its overnight mail delivery, overnight mail and small parcel delivery. And what they will do is they will gather up all of these overnight parcels, they'll stick them in a big bag, and then they give them to FedEx, and FedEx gets them to the city where they're going to go, and then the USPS picks them up and then redistributes them. And the reason they do this is it's a lot cheaper that way. FedEx is really, really good at moving packages quickly from one place to another. And it's way cheaper for the US Postal Service to pay FedEx to do this than it is for them to do it themselves, because FedEx has already built all the infrastructure that's expressly designed for doing one thing, which is overnight. However, I had a conversation earlier this year with a woman who drives a rural route for the USPS, and she carries FedEx packages. And the reason that she carries FedEx packages is because FedEx doesn't send its couriers way, way out on deep rural routes. Every town in America has a post office. By law, it's required, and it's horribly inefficient. But it's also really necessary, because if you live in a remote, small town, you really, really need to have access to mail services, or you can't live your life. And so the government has decided that it is worth the expense to do this horribly inefficient thing, which is pay people to drive dozens and dozens of miles on small country dirt roads in order to deliver letters to the people who live out there. And it is more efficient for FedEx to give them their packages for delivery than it is for FedEx to replicate that same infrastructure. So, which is the right answer? And this is the question that I think it comes down to. What are you trying to optimize for? Efficiency or access? And so that's essentially my take on the public housing, or the affordable housing debate. Is it an efficiency problem or is it an access problem? And I would say it's both. If it were just an access problem, what you would have is an enormous amount of available housing that's simply too expensive for people to buy, which is not this is not the case in San Francisco, and it's not the case in Portland. What you also have is just simply not enough available housing. On the other hand, if your approach is a purely privatized version, which is all we need to do is make housing as easy and cheap and fast to build as possible, what you're going to end up with is a glut of luxury apartments that people still cannot afford. And so what you need is actually a combination of both approaches. And you need to be very, very smart about when you apply each one. So this is the genius that I'm going to point to here. Not me being the genius, the question is the genius. Okay, last one. And I'm going to call this the creative genius dilemma. Which is the better way to create a good or service that people are actually going to use? Is it by consulting the wisdom of the crowd, or is it by letting a lone, brilliant, creative person fully realize their vision? So, again, this is the argument. Individuals are subject to bias and ego and unpredictable influences, but groups of people are far more likely to balance out the extremes. Groups of people offer a realistic picture of needs and aspirations that you will not get if you just talk to a single person, no matter who that single person is. Conversely, design by committee never gave us anything innovative, right? Design by committee is like, it's a dirty word. The great success stories of the creative world come from a single mind with a clear vision who is undaunted by conventional wisdom. That's why I have a picture of Steve Jobs there. This is basically who every CEO or whatever references when they're like, I'm not going to listen to the crowd. Steve Jobs didn't listen to the crowds. Well, it turns out he actually did. He was actually, Apple does research. But, well, let me get into some examples. So one of the reasons that I put up this jelly bean picture is when people talk about wisdom of the crowds and kind of emergent behavior and all of these things, a lot of the examples that they reference are things like, if you have a bunch of jelly beans in a jar and you ask one person to guess, and versus if you ask 50 people to guess and then you average their guesses, the average is actually going to be more accurate than 90+% of the individual guesses. And this is like magic, and so we ascribe this kind of magical quality to large groups. And there are circumstances in which it is kind of, statistics is sort of like magic sometimes. But here's the problem. And this just comes straight off of Wikipedia, right? Wisdom of the crowd research attributes the superiority of averages to the elimination of individual noise, but this assumes two things. That it assumes that the individuals making each decision are independent from each other. And it also assumes that you have a diverse set of opinions and ideologies among the people who are involved in the decision making. That's actually a very specific case, right? It means something like a carnival where you have a bunch of people who don't know each other and may come from anywhere all guessing. If you have a group of people who are all going to discuss the answer together before they make the guess, that magic goes away. So this is the other thing, though, is that crowds work best when there is, in fact, a correct answer to the question. And this is part of the problem with creative insight is a lot of times there is not actually a correct answer. So it's not like you have a whole lot of people who are all making their best guess about something where there is, in fact, a best answer, right? For many people, the best answer is their best answer, not the best answer. And understanding the difference between the two is crucial. So this is where the genius comes from. Is there a correct answer? Can the people that you're asking form independent judgments? And can the lone genius that you're deferring to credibly represent the intended user? So, and this last one is sort of, that's the Steve Jobs exception, essentially. The reason that Apple has such a great track record for coming up with new products is because they could credibly represent their intended user. They were essentially designing for themselves because the people who worked at Apple are relatively representative of the people who buy Apple products. And that's a very specific scenario. It is not the scenario for a lot of other people making creative decisions, and this is where people get into trouble. So, those are my four examples. So I'm going to kind of try and summarize this a little bit. How did we go about doing this? Well, the genius of the third way is what I'm going to call it. You start off by asking, if you believe wholeheartedly in approach A, the first thing you need to do is look at approach B and say, okay, when people arguing for approach B make their argument, what examples are they thinking of? Because chances are they're thinking of different ones than you are. Do they have a point? And in most cases, they do. In what circumstances would you agree that their point is correct? And then, what is the difference between the scenarios that you keep referencing and the scenarios that they keep referencing? And ideally, if you can find their scenario and your scenario, an example of their and your scenarios that are mostly similar, or at least have similar outcomes, similar aims in mind, that actually makes the comparison much, much easier. For example, Spotify versus a record player versus playing the banjo. All of them are about getting to a song, and that makes the comparison much easier. Because when that part, right, you're trying to reduce the number of variables. I was trained as an engineer, so this was like a thing that we talk about a lot. The more you can reduce variables, the easier it becomes to determine what is actually the significant difference between them. And so if all three of the examples you're looking at are about getting into a song, what's the difference? The difference is how specific is the intended outcome. And then, can you turn that difference into a test or a set of questions? That's the genius. And then I'm going to add one more additional one, which is this kind of more meta takeaway, which is, why do these dilemmas get so calcified? Why do we buy into them so deeply in the first place? And an awful lot of times, it's because we find either ideology A or ideology B to be very comforting, right? I think one of the reasons why the creative lone genius myth is still so pervasive is because it makes creative people feel important. And that's fine. That doesn't make it wrong, but it also doesn't make it right? It makes it useful, and this is kind of like, if there's a big ask that I have of kind of creative professionals here, it's to understand your own inherent preferences for the things that reinforce your own worldview. So whenever you do come across an opposing ideology, especially when it comes to like creative work, it's worth taking a step back and asking if the main reason that you're opposed to it is not for pragmatic reasons, but because it is emotionally satisfying. I mean, we work in an emotional field, and rightly so, and it's good to be aware of them, but it can also be damaging as well as helpful. So that's all I've got. That's my website, and that's me on Twitter. I don't tweet all that much, and my website is just a bunch of links to my articles, but if you're interested, feel free to check it out.